Welcome back to Odds of War. My name's Matt, and today we're doing the second video in our series that we're calling The Art of Wargaming. So basically what that is, if you haven't seen the first episode, you can check that out there. I'll put a link in the video there, and you can check out the first video and sort of get a feel for it, but I'll also just give you a quick rundown here. We're basically taking Sun Tzu's Art of War, and we are seeing how we can relate it to wargaming in all its forms. Now, it's not primarily applicable just to Games Workshop games. Like, obviously, here on the channel, we play almost exclusively Kill Team. We've done a single Warhammer 40K battle report, but you can probably expect those in the future. But what I really want it to be is widely applicable to all wargaming, because I think the principles are the same. So, with that being said, let's get right into it, into Chapter 2, Waging War. So, just starting off, we're just, Waging War is a, let's see, basically 2.5 page chapter, so it's pretty short here. So, we're just going to cover this whole chapter in this episode. So starting off with verse 1 here, Sun Tzu said, "In the operations of war, where there are in the field 1,000 swift chariots, as many heavy chariots, and 100,000 mail-clad soldiers, with provisions enough to carry them 1,000 li, the expenditure at home and at the front, including entertainment of guests, small items such as glue and paint, and sums spent on chariots and armor, will reach the total of 1,000 ounces of silver per day. Such is the cost of raising an army of 100,000 men." That's not super applicable to everything that we're going to be talking about as far as waging war, but I just think it's one really fun that it lists small items such as glue and paint, because of course as miniature wargaming hobbyists, that's something that we go through a lot. And I think really the value of that verse there, while not applicable to playing any particular match or anything like that, I think it's super applicable to getting a force ready, whether that's a kill team, an army, a mercenary war band, anything like that. I think it's really important to understand the cost of the game, the cost of the models, the glue, the paint, the time investment to get your force table ready. So sometimes people will say, "Oh, isn't that hobby very expensive?" And admittedly, it is quite expensive if you're looking at the upfront cost. But if you look at the money spent per entertainment value, it's actually quite a cheap hobby, wargaming, because while it does have a high upfront cost of buying models, buying glue, buying paint, getting your models ready to go, if you're looking at it holistically, you're spending so much time. You're building, you're painting, and then you're playing. And so if you look at, like, here in the US, going to movies can, especially at, a nice movie theater in the evening at peak times, maybe something like 3D, IMAX, whatever, something like that, you can run up into the 20, 30, especially if you're buying something like you're getting popcorns and an icy and stuff like that. You can be spending close to $50 just for 2 hours of entertainment, whereas, a box of models is close to $50 or something like that, depending on which box you're getting. And that's going to provide you multiple hours building, painting, and playing, and then the more you play with those models, the more time and value you're sort of getting out of them. So that's just something I like to think about as far as the cost of the hobby. For anyone thinking about getting into any particular war game, I think it's really a good use of your money and your time, because it's good value. The next point that I want to pull out of Chapter 2, Waging War here, is going to be spread across a couple different verses, so I'm going to skip around. Okay, so starting in verses 2 and 3, "When you engage in actual fighting, if victory is long in coming, then men's weapons will grow dull and their ardor will be damped. If you lay siege to a town, you will exhaust your strength. Again, if the campaign is protracted, the resources of the state will not be equal to the strain." Skipping to 5, "Thus, though we have heard of stupid haste in war, cleverness has never been associated with long delays. There is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. And then skipping to 19, which is near the end of the chapter. In war, then, let your great object be victory, not lengthy campaigns. So I think this is applicable on two sorts of levels. The very first level, I think, is sort of a wider meta level. Like it says, your ardor will be damped, your swords will grow dull, and things like that. You need to be on the same page with your opponent about what sort of length of game that you're going to be playing, what sort of pace of game you're going to be playing. If you're going to, say, a tournament, you're going to have that laid out for you because there's going to be rounds, there's going to be a timer, so you know what you're trying to do. But, you know, let's say you're going to get together with a friend and you're expecting something like a relaxed affair. You don't really care about making it all the way through the turns of the game. You're just looking to get at the table and relax and have fun with your friends, rolling dice and just, you know, seeing what happens. But they're looking for a tight competitive game. You're going to have a difference of opinion there, especially if you are saying, I want to sit here and relax and spend all night. We're getting together in the late afternoon and we're going to just play into the wee hours of the morning. That's a much different perception if your friend, if your opponent is like, I want to come in, I want to knock out the rounds and just like bam, 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 and we're going to be done in like 2-3 hours, you know, or in the case of small skirmish games, maybe 45 minutes, you know. And so those things are very different. So it's good to have that sort of discussion with your opponent, with your friends, with your play group. You know, what are we looking for out of the game? Next, in a more granular level, these same verses, if we add in verse 4 to that, you go, now when your weapons are dulled, your ardor damped, your strength exhausted, and your treasure spent, other chieftains will spring up to take advantage of your extremity. Then no man, however wise, will be able to avert the consequences that must ensue. So, again, jumping to 19, in war, let your great object be victory, not lengthy campaigns. I think this is really important to understanding your army, your kill team, your force, whatever. Understanding your force is important. Every force plays slightly differently and is going to have a preferred pace of the game. And so some are going to be very quick and they want to crush their enemy as quickly as possible before they get crushed, you know, the sort of glass hammer type. Some are going to be slow, methodical. They're there to outlast. Other forces are going to be a mixture of that. You know, those are the two extremities, right? And then there's an entire gamut in between those things. It's really important for you to understand where your team, where your force wants to be. I myself think that a lot of the game of Kill Team and of 40K comes alive on the second turn. The first turn, you deploy, and then you get positioned in first turn, and then the game really opens up in the second turn. And then depending on how the second turn is, you sort of set the pace of the game. What you want to do is you want to set the pace of the game to your pace. You want to be playing your game, not playing your opponent's game. So that's going back to if the campaign, verse 3, if the campaign is protracted, the resources of the state will not be equal to the strain. If you're playing your opponent's game, you're playing into their hand, you're playing at the pace they want, they're getting to dictate the game, then you're going to be on the losing side. It's really important that you try to enact your team's, your force's will upon the table. So, and it's not just, it's both for you, you know, what sort of pace do you like to play? Do you like to play an aggressive army? Do you like to play a defensive army? That sort of thing. But it's also, if you're playing something like 40K or Kill Team, where there's this vast swath of different armies and different play styles, each one of them is going to have a preferred pace of the game. And even further down into that, if you get into sub-factions, if you get into specific team or army builds, they're going to have a way that they want to play. So it's your job to, one, of course, figure that out. How does your army want to play? And then make sure that you're playing the game that way, that you're setting the pace of the game to control that. Now, if you are sort of behind the 8 ball playing into your opponent's hand, you have to look into that and say, okay, what can I do now to get out of that? Going back to verse 5, though we have heard of stupid haste in war, cleverness has never been associated with long delays. So you want to hit the timing just right, so to speak, with your force. You don't want to rush. You don't want to overextend to try to claw the game back from your opponent. But you must at some point commit hard to bring the game back into your favor. If you are in control of the pace of the game, again, you don't want to overextend. You don't want to try to push the lead that you may have so far that then you give your opponent an opportunity to bring it back. You want to be able to take the lead, play the game at your pace, and then control that pace, neither rushing, never having that stupid haste in war, but also not delaying and having that sort of dullard mentality. So moving on to some later verses, sort of the middle of the chapter here, we get to verse 8. The skillful soldier does not raise a second levy, neither are his supply wagons loaded more than twice. Bring war material with you from home, but forage on the enemy. Thus the army will have food enough for its needs. Skipping to verse 15, hence a wise general makes a point of foraging on the enemy. 1 cartload of the enemy's provisions is equivalent to 20 of one's own, and likewise a single picule of his provender is equivalent to 20 from one's own store. So obviously you're going to have your game plan. That's your supplies, your war material, your supply wagons. That's your game plan. That's your how you like to play, what we were just talking about. And then your enemy's provisions, your what you're going to be foraging from the enemy is your knowledge of your enemy's game plan, your opponent's game plan. One of the biggest things you can do, deny your opponent the way they want to play. So, for example, if you are up against an extremely shooting heavy force, you don't want to get shot off the board. One of the biggest things you can do is hide from them. Get out of the line of sight of them, get out of their range, render their weapons useless, and force them into doing something they don't want to do. So that's the sort of foraging on your enemy, is going, okay, I know you want to do this, so I will do everything in my power to not allow you to do that, to just literally make it impossible for you to do it or very costly for you to do it. Thus, you're using their own plan, you're using their own force against them. Same thing in 40K. A lot of fuss is made for melee armies about wrapping and trapping. So that's where you charge a unit, you get into combat with it, and you don't kill it, and then you move your models around it so that it stops that unit, the enemy unit, from being able to fall back, and thus it stops your unit from being shot in your opponent's turn. So that's like another great example of like using your opponent's resources against them. When they have these, and you can do it in Kill Team as well, where maybe you charge multiple models and then consolidate into and trap other models, things like that. When you're doing that, you're basically making your opponents, their own models, their own miniatures, their own force, a liability to themselves. And that's really powerful. If you can do that, if you can make your opponent regret having a model, a unit, regret having a specific rule, that's both powerful on the table in terms of you start really shifting the power of the game in your favor, but it's also very powerful psychologically where your opponent goes, oh man, I've made a big mistake. Now they're thinking about that. And again, it's decision fatigue. If there's so much to think about that they start having to, you layer on another thing to think about where you go, I'm using your own plan against you. They open up to even more mistakes. Using another example for that, let's say you have a force that you're very slow. Your force is very slow, and you're against a force that's very, very fast. You have two options. Either one, you can hem them in, thus you are rendering, usually fast armies are they're very fast, but they are brittle, so they break easily. And if you hem them in, you just totally remove really their biggest strength, and then again you make them play their game, so they are not able to leverage what they bring to the table, thus making them much weaker. Or you get completely out to the absolute edges of the board, the table, whatever, what have you. You get into the line of sight, blocking things that force them to maximize their movement to the absolute utmost. Because ultimately, even fast armies and things like that, they want to stay somewhat in a cohesive force. So you make them lose that cohesion, because they have to be, if they want to be able to touch this over here and touch that over there, whether that's in shooting or melee or what have you, they're going to have to overextend to both directions. And then you get into that point where you go, okay, now I've used your own speed against you because you've broken up your own force. So there's just a couple of easy examples of how you can use your enemy's own battle plans, so to speak, against them, foraging off your enemy. So that's basically it for Chapter 2, Waging War. It's a pretty short chapter, applicable in sort of a broad sense, but I think it's really important, because if you can, number one, the pace of the game, if you have that agreement with your opponent that you want something, that you both have the same idea for the pace of the game, and you have this in mind about foraging off of your enemy and forcing them to play your game, using their own game style against them. These can be very powerful things to leverage to the table. So thank you so much. That's episode 2 of Art of Wargaming, chapter 2, Waging War. I think a lot of it is really cool. I really like this series. It's nice to read through the Art of War and sort of think about how to apply it to wargaming. It's been a good exercise. If you do like this video, hit that thumbs up button for me. And down in the comments, let me know what you think. What are some ways that you forage off your enemies? What are some of the ways that you try to set the pace of the game? Questions, comments, things like that. I would love to hear it. Let me know down in the comments what you thought. If you have not subscribed to the channel here, make sure to hit that button right there. You can subscribe to us. We'll be very appreciative of it. And if you want to, again, see the first video in the Art of Wargaming series, you can hit that button right there. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye.